All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming and joining us for 77 days election to inauguration. This important and I bet informative session for NCJW. I'm Lisa Gubernick, the VP of Membership for NCJW. We created these Zoom sessions as a way for our members and many non-members to feel engaged and have an opportunity to ask questions of our local experts. Tonight, we focus on our current state with the election on Tuesday. We are currently waiting for several states to report their totals. I will introduce our panel and our very own Heather Silverman, the Director of Policy and Evaluation of NCJW St. Louis, will help to moderate the discussion and pose questions to our panel. You can put any questions in the chat and Heather will ask them. Also, since our moderator and panelists will be doing most of the talking this evening, we invite you to change your screen to speaker view. Our operator, Lauren, is putting instructions in the chat if you need them. Now I will introduce our esteemed panel. Rachel Lippmann, the reporter at St. Louis Public Radio since 2008, covering state and local elections and government, as well as federal and state courts. She is a St. Louis native. She spent 2 years in Michigan covering state government and politics for the radio stations there. And I love this part. She spends her free time taking socially distant walks with her pup and fiance, watches too many baking shows, and wears her mask. Thank you, Rachel. Tony Messinger is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch Metro columnist, a position he's held since September 2015. He was previously the editorial page editor at the Post-Dispatch and was hired at the paper in 2008 in the State Capitol Bureau. He began his career at a small weekly newspaper in Colorado, where he was born and raised. He has worked in Colorado, Arizona, Nebraska, South Dakota, Missouri at weeklies, dailies, and magazines. In recent years, Messinger has won the Sigma Delta Chi Award and national headliner for editorial writing, a Missouri Honor Medal from University of Missouri, and in 2019, a Pulitzer Prize. His first book, The Price of Poverty, a story of profit and abuse in the name of justice, is being published by St. Martin's Press and is due out by late 2021. Messinger lives in Wildwood with his wife and 2 children. He has 4 grown children and 8 grandchildren. And in no particular order, Mead has been doing political organizing work on women and children's issues for the past 25 years. She worked for the National Abortion and Reproductive Rights Action League and the National Association of Children Advocates in Washington, D.C. She is a past executive director of Missouri NARAL and mother of 2 boys. Prior to her current position, Mead ran a joint project of the Missouri NARAL Foundation and Planned Parenthood affiliates called Show Me Choice 2000. As the Director of Policy and Organizing for Planned Parenthood Advocates, Mead works with the public affairs and grassroots organizing staff of the 2 Planned Parenthood affiliates in the state to engage as many supporters in the political process to advance and defend Planned Parenthood's education and medical services. Mead has held several leadership positions within Planned Parenthood, including past chair and secretary of the State Public Affairs Network. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Heather Silverman, and she will take it from here.
Thank you, Lisa. And thanks again to our panelists and to all of you who are attending. We're really excited about this program. So to our panelists, and we'll go ahead and start with Rachel and then move to Tony and then Evie in order to start with that framework. What were your big takeaways from this election cycle in terms of how the campaigns were run, just generally, and also with the pandemic, the candidates that ran, and the outcomes?
So I was thinking about kind of how to sum up the election in a few words, and my big takeaway was high hopes dashed. I think especially in Missouri. You had a lot of really, really good, really strong candidates running in Missouri. Up and down the ballot, you cannot look and say these were people who were putting themselves out there as quote unquote sacrificial lambs. They weren't running simply just to run on a ticket as perennial candidates. And none of the races, especially in Missouri, the presidential is a very different story, but none of the races in Missouri were close. None of them were close, despite having these really strong candidates. I don't know whether it was polling was telling them something wrong, enthusiasm was telling them something wrong. There was a gap between enthusiasm that, you know, party leaders felt and the party voters felt. But I think especially in Missouri and then over on the Illinois side with the Rodney Davis, Betsy Dirksen Londrigan, there was a lot of hope that this would be a wave year. And for whatever reason, in Missouri especially, it just wasn't. And it wasn't, I don't think, the fault of the candidates. I mean, there were some exceptionally qualified candidates running for all of these posts. So that was sort of my big thing was just there were a lot of hopes that were dashed pretty quickly and pretty early, especially in Missouri. None of those races were particularly close. The closest one, I think, was Shoup Wagner, and that wasn't even all that close. So that was kind of my big takeaway, just sort of in general. Obviously, pandemic campaigning looks very, very different, but we already sort of knew that that was going to be the case after August and even kind of leading up to it in March. So that really didn't surprise me all that much that you saw candidates kind of adjust how they were going to do campaigning, and I think sort of found the rhythm and the way to do it. I'm sure those of you who have been candidates who have run for office or have volunteered know that it's very difficult to sort of get the energy going when you can't get 100,000 people onto the arch grounds as Obama did back when he was running. But just in terms of adapting to the pandemic, I think candidates did it as best as they could to be able to do it safely.
I think in one word to build off of what Rachel was talking about, I would define this election as one in which division is sort of the key takeaway theme. You look at what happened in Missouri, and there's always been an urban-rural split in Missouri, but it was incredibly defined in this particular election when you look at how the statewide races weren't close at all. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think the Trump phenomenon is so unique that this statewide election and the last statewide election are going to be tossed out a little bit when political scientists go back and look at voting trends, because it was just such a massive division in Missouri. But Missouri is emblematic of the nation, not in the way that it used to be as a bellwether, but in the way of how incredibly divided we are. I think a lot of us had hope that the nation was going to repudiate Trumpism, and to some degree they did. I think we're actually going to get within a week or two to the point where Joe Biden won by pretty historic numbers in both the electoral votes and the popular vote. So there are going to be many ways to say, wow, this really was a repudiation of Trumpism. But when you look at the map of the nation looks a lot like the map of Missouri. Very, very red, very, very blue, not a whole lot in between. And unfortunately for people that are independent voters, something that I write about myself in tomorrow's column, it leaves us sort of out of the conversation. The biggest surprise in Missouri to me was the passage of Amendment 3. And it's related to that division, related to the disinformation and dishonesty that I think is emblematic of our political world these days. But that vote surprised me. I still thought that was going to be the one vote where there was going to be enough rural-urban crossover to defeat it and keep the Clean Missouri reforms in place, but it didn't happen.
And Mevi?
Sure. So I want to both respond to what Tony and Rachel have said about Missouri with my perspective, both in Missouri and nationally. So and I'm biased here. I'm a political organizer, which means my job is to engage people in the political process. And I love that. I've been doing it my whole lengthy career. I love another organizer to whom I am married. So there's my bias. Engaging people in the political process is my thing. But that is what I think happened this cycle. I feel that for sure a lot of people woke up after the 2016 election and said, by golly, I have to get involved. And they did get involved. And one way to account for this at the federal level is this is the largest cycle of Planned Parenthood staff and Planned Parenthood patients or adjacent Planned Parenthood workers are making their way into Congress to be our representatives. So people who actually are in this field of either providing or advocating for reproductive health and freedom are going to be in Congress. So I'm thinking here, for example, of Tina Smith, a senator from Minnesota, as a former colleague of mine in the public policy area. Another colleague of mine, Nikema Williams, is a representative-elect in Georgia. We have 4 members of Congress who talk regularly about using patient services. And I'm just talking about the federal level now. And then I think people might be surprised to know that Reverend Warnock in Georgia, who is headed for that runoff, is a former sex educator. So I think these are people who maybe previously would have thought, I'm a regular person. I work in this field. I'm not meant for the halls of Congress. And 2016 really helped people see that we've got to take the reins of our democracy. And this is a theme throughout Missouri, and I'll get to Amendment 3 in a sec, but where the Missourians, with passing Medicaid in the August ballot, Medicaid expansion, with raising the minimum wage, with doing what we were trying to do to protect our democracy and make democracy fairer in Missouri with CLEAN in 2018, which Amendment 3 undid by and large some of the most important parts. So Missouri is on our way. I feel like in this cycle in this country is on our way to people trying to engage at a higher level in democracy. Specifically in Missouri, though, I think this cycle, yes, I agree with Rachel, dashed hopes, but it's also, we have to be thinking that this is a long game. This is the best crop of pro-reproductive health, and they are Democratic candidates we've had in a long, long time who ran really smart campaigns, but it's going to take, I think, several cycles to dig out of this Republican-dominated narrative that has developed in Missouri. So just another proof point there. Democratic turnout statewide increased this cycle over 2016 by roughly 16%, which is amazing. And again, evidence of people really getting involved. But Republicans advanced their turnout also by a little over 7%, but given in 2016 they were 16% ahead, that the 16% increase that the Dems did this cycle just wasn't enough. We have to do more, and it's going to take several cycles to do it with this kind of smart, savvy, modern crop of candidates that we had this cycle to keep us going.
Thanks, guys. I do want to move to a follow-up question that was in the chat. Do you guys think that, so Democratic candidates predominantly use social distance techniques. They didn't do a lot of canvassing, with an exception being Doug Beck, who did canvass and interestingly did win his race, whereas Senator Shoup and Representative Lavender, who are both well known for their ground games, did not use them this term. Do you think that that played a role, or do you think other things played more of a role?
I think it probably played a role, but I think they did the right thing. I mean, this is one of the things that I think we'd like to have from our politicians a little bit more, and specifically as we've been dealing with the pandemic. I want our political leaders to be courageous enough to make the right decision, even if that means they're going to lose. And if the lack of canvassing saved lives but lost an election, so be it. I'm not a on the street organizer, and I haven't looked at, you know, ward level numbers and all of those things to really determine if in a specific race that made a difference. But I think probably statewide to some degree it did, because the Democrats weren't doing that. Obviously on the national level, it doesn't look like it did, but that's a completely different animal with the sort of media exposure that Joe Biden and Kamala Harris were able to get just naturally through the debate process and everything else. So I think probably so. And but I don't think Democrats should look at that and say, boy, we should have canvassed. From where I sit, I think they did the right thing. And if that's the nature of it had an effect on this election cycle, that's just the way it is, and they should be proud of what they did.
My gut tells me possibly not. Maybe in like a really, really, really close race where it is coming down to where the percentages are narrower, or, you know, the vote totals are a little bit closer, maybe that would have made a difference to get people out. I think what you're looking at with Wagner, Shoup, and Koenig, Lavender is known, but Koenig's an incumbent. He's known. It's a name that people recognize. Doug Beck was also not trying to flip a seat. It would have been an open seat because Scott Sifton was termed out, but it was a seat held by Democrats. And it may just be that area leans slightly more Democratic, and therefore the party was able to hold simply because of identification. In a closer race, maybe I think you could possibly point to canvassing. I'm not sure if any of those races were close enough for, you know, voter contact to have mattered. But again, I'm not diving into ward, precinct, et cetera numbers to really look and say, you know, we know that they targeted this area and it really turned people in that area out.
Thanks. And Mevi, we'll move on to you. Just a reminder to those writing in the chat and to our panelists that we are a 501c3, so we do not take positions on candidates. We do on issues. And the things that we're saying here are really just for edification, not to say that a certain candidate should or should not have our support.
Thanks, Heather. And for sure, I'll just restate that I am absolutely speaking on behalf of Planned Parenthood advocates, not NCJW, in my comments here, and totally support and appreciate and love partnering with you all on the C3 allowable activities that you so greatly conduct, and encouraging anyone to run for office, regardless of position or party is hopefully within your pale, because I just did that. Okay, so in terms of the methods of campaigning, I agree with both Tony and Rachel. It's going to be hard to tell. It sure felt difficult as a practitioner in the field to not quite be in the field. And once some of the campaigns were able to look at the evidence, look at the rates, follow CDC guidelines about outdoor events or social distancing and with masks, it did feel better and more comfortable, but that's just what I was used to. What I would say here is I think the difference that I felt was that the candidates I was working with, and of course the organization I work for, is very evidence-based in everything we have to do as a Planned Parenthood healthcare provider supporter has to be evidence-based, and there just wasn't enough evidence to tell candidates that it was okay to do this but not that. I think we gathered a lot of evidence throughout the campaign and throughout the whole summer of protests that, for example, you know, the Black Lives Matter protests have been shown not to be super spreader events, but we just didn't have enough to make the safe decisions that Tony's talking about. And the other side wasn't concerned about that, wasn't thinking about that. Clearly, you know, Governor Parson repeatedly talked about that wasn't a thing that he was thinking about. And so to me, that was my takeaway, that here you had a set of people who were really, really concerned about what the evidence was showing, and it was impacting their campaign plans and tactics, and that there was another set of people who weren't. And I do think that, you know, digging in at that precinct level that Rachel talked about might tell us more about that, but zooming out, that's the picture for me, that was a really clear distinction in how the campaigns approached the issue.
Thank you. There's a lot of discussion in the chat about Amendment 3, but there was a follow-up question that I think fits in nicely here that I'd like to ask before we move on. Missouri is the state of Harriet Woods, Tom Eagleton, Dick Gebhardt, and Claire McCaskill. What happened to us? What do you guys think?
Wow. To some degree, the Republicans identified sort of more than a decade ago a path for them, a culture war path built around guns and abortion primarily, and they magnified it, and it built and it changed. I think when you look at the history of Missouri politics, a lot of those rural areas that used to be heavily Democratic had manufacturing plants. I've written a lot in the last couple of years about St. Francis County and Dent County, and both had manufacturing plants that were tied to either the St. Louis shoe industry or the or car making, and parts and suppliers and all of that. And those plants are for the most part gone, and so those union jobs in those small towns are gone, and that erases the natural Democratic connection to those towns. And so the electorate is changing, and the combination of money, term limits, and just the natural change of things that happen in the legislative process has really sort of built up the Republican brand in Missouri. And there is just such a stark divide between the cities and the counties. One other geographic point that I'll make: I'm from Colorado. And Colorado, I used to think Colorado and Missouri were very much alike, in that Colorado had the city of Denver that was very much a Democratic bastion, and a whole lot of rural areas in the mountains and in the farmland and eastern plains that tended to be a little bit more Republican. And Colorado would go back and forth. We'd have a Republican governor, then a Democratic governor, etc. Missouri used to be very much like that. We used to go back and forth. But part of the problem in Missouri is its two big cities are both border cities. So Kansas City is partly in Kansas and partly in Missouri as far as the metro area. St. Louis, Missouri, and Illinois similarly. And so our major population centers are split between a couple of states. And that makes advertising in the political world a little bit different, organizing a little bit different. And I think it reduces the amount of impact that both St. Louis and Kansas City can have on the rest of the state. Whereas in Colorado, Denver's right in the middle and is always the center of economic attention in that state. And eventually, through a period of time, I mean, in this particular election, Colorado very much had a blue wave. Missouri did not.
I've been searching for some of the work that my colleague Jason Rosenbaum has written on this. He's especially interested in sort of the northeastern Missouri part of the state, and I've been trying to find it to be able to post the links in there. But he's done a lot of sort of debriefs with Democratic Party leaders on his podcast about sort of how they are going to rebuild this party now, and sort of the geographic issues that Tony mentioned. Jason is fascinated by Northeast Missouri. That's kind of the Hannibal, Quincy Market area. And he's done a lot of good work on that. If I find the links, I'll post them in the chat. But I think like Tony mentioned, the Democratic Party hasn't been able to find what they can offer for these communities in a way that seems to speak to their needs. And I don't know how they do that. I'm obviously not a consultant in any way, shape, or form, but it's been something that Jason has talked about extensively on the podcast since 2016 and 2017, really, just about how you rebuild. And they were bullish on this year, which goes back to the, dashed expectations, dashed hopes, but yeah.
Yeah, so I'll just add that I think it is demographics. So just in terms of Missouri losing population and the population being older and whiter relative to how it has been over the decades, and that impacts. It's structural in that the Republicans did have a long game, starting with term limits in the mid-90s, seeing that would knock out a bunch of Democrats and create more of a competitive ground for them, and they prepped for that. And then using gerrymandering, and gerrymandering is a neutral term, it's not a partisan term, and what it has meant in Missouri is that there are political trades among these commissions that get appointed to draw maps, and there are trades that, to make Democratic seats more safer, Democrats were willing to let Republicans draw some very, very gerrymandered and Republican only. And that led the combination of the gerrymandering with Democrats protecting their seat and ceding parts of the state that really shouldn't have been ceded, combined with term limits, created this Republican path to disproportionately taking over the state legislature, and then using that. And so the third element is messaging. So how the Republican, along with the structural reform, decided to take those voters that Tony was talking about, who for whom their connection to their union or their job was seen as something that the Democrats cared about, and do intentional divisive politics around race and class, and populate people's minds who might be hurting with that it is the other guy that is hurting them, as opposed to the wealthy corporate interests. And then the wealthy corporate interests, while those two elements, and I would argue women are in there as well, as being pitted against each other, thus I think the abortion and guns that Tony mentioned are stand-ins for these efforts to divide and scare voters, those are the combination of factors that have gotten Missouri there. And frankly, I don't think we've tackled that head on, particularly. Rachel mentioned she's not a paid political consultant. I think the paid political consultant industrial complex said Democrats play it safe, hold on to the seats you've got, and don't address this thing that's going on. And I'm excited that I'm a part of a project called the Race Class Narrative that has done research that shows that there are voters who, once you address this issue more head on, you can unfill some of the space in voters' brains that is getting taken over by fear of race origin or class origin, and put a united and a progress oriented way of thinking in their head. You can get those voters. There's been great work in Minnesota and Wisconsin, and data that shows, and we even have data in Missouri that shows that those voters are gettable, but it's going to take time, and it's going to take candidates that are high quality and willing to address that issue to get those voters back. And it's just going to take giving voters some options. Now, when we get to talking about Amendment 3, those options just got a little messy, and we can talk about how we're going to address that.
I also just want to add that I'm also not an unpaid political consultant in any way, shape, or form, but if you want advice, puppies are always good. I vote for puppies. Dogs, cats, emotional support animals, whatever.
I love it. Let's go ahead and let's move on to Amendment 3. And then we'll get on to sort of the main event with the presidential election, because I know that everyone on the call is excited to talk about that. So what do you guys think went wrong there, and what's the impact?
Well, the deceit worked. I mean, clearly the Republicans in the legislature designed a completely deceptive and cynical amendment to undo the voters' will. There's just, that's not an opinion, that's just a matter of fact. 3 different judges and or groups of judges made that finding, tried to rewrite the legislation, and they just failed in their attempt to rewrite it in a way that was fair and accurate. And so some voters, I think, were fooled by the deception. But this is where this whole idea of a supermajority causes damage in a state that I don't think actually electorally looks like its legislature. When every Republican lawmaker is going home to their district with absolutely no opposition and saying, vote for this because George Soros is trying to take over our legislative system. And that's exactly what they were telling rural Missourians. And there's nobody running against them to stop it. Republicans are just going to check the box. You know, one of the things I point out in my column that's in tomorrow's paper is that there were 82 House districts up for election on Tuesday, half of the Missouri House, that had no legitimate opponent. And some of them, I believe about 30 of them were Democrats, 52 of them were Republicans. Some of them had nominal Libertarian or Green Party opponents, but that's half of the House in a House that's already too big, 163 members. Not having an opponent, that's not an election. That's not giving anybody back home at the local chicken dinner, town hall, whatever, 2 local folks who you know because you see them at the gas station and at the grocery store and at the local school, having a debate about the issue and somebody telling you something different. Most of rural Missouri heard one version of the story other than what they saw on TV, and that's it. And they don't get a local newspaper in much of rural Missouri anymore. The Post-Dispatch, the Kansas City Star, and the Springfield News Leader don't reach into the areas that they used to. And so they're getting one set of facts, and it's from their local state rep who's running unopposed, and they're going to vote for him come hell or high water, or her. And that's a big problem. That's the big challenge for Missouri. And that's why there's such a dichotomy between Missourians passed Medicaid expansion, which absolutely they should have. Missourians opposed right to work. Missourians passed legalized marijuana and a higher minimum wage. All of those things are in complete opposition to the people that they're electing and sending to the state house who opposed all of those things. So there is a way to get to Missouri voters on some of these issues, but it's completely made more difficult because the legislature is gerrymandered and many of those state reps do not face real competition when some of these other issues are on the ballot.
I'm going to agree with the ballot summary being written the way it was. I saw my parents briefly in the midst of all of this, and they were asking about, hey, what's with Amendment 3? And I had to explain that basically what it was doing was undoing a previously approved previously approved voter initiative because the legislature wanted to undo it. If you read the ballot summary, and let's be real, that's what most people are paying attention to. They're going to tune out most things about the ballot initiatives, the amendments, etc., or they're not aware that they're on the ballot because it was a very long ballot, especially in the St. Louis County area with the judges being on the ballot. And if you read the summary of Amendment 3, it mentioned lobbyist gifts, and a few other things that people are going to sit there and be like, oh yeah, that sounds good. I want a bipartisan commission to draw the borders for the state house districts. I want to limit lobbyists' gifts to, or completely eliminate lobbyists' gifts. It sounded good if you didn't realize what it was actually changing. It sounded like it was reforming the status quo, but I think people forgot what the status quo was, and that was Clean Missouri, which had been approved just 2 years before and was about to take effect. So I think it was a matter of just people also forgot that status quo was these changes, Clean Missouri, nonpartisan demographer, et cetera.
Yeah, I'll just add that they threw everything at the effort once they had sloppily passed this thing in their COVID session of the Missouri legislature. And even the chair of the committee approving the measure said, this is a terrible measure. It's filled with terrible, potentially illegal things. It's going to go down in flames. And he predicted that. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. That was the path we were on. But then it was legal barrier after legal barrier, which really on their side, while it did rewrite the ballot language so it wasn't as terrible as what the legislature wrote, it helped them push the No on 3 campaign into the last minute, because you can't launch a campaign against a thing until you know what the thing is going to say on the ballot, to Rachel's point. And so I saw in the chat some people saying that mashed up with the COVID pandemic and the unprecedented desire to vote early to follow evidence and keep their family and themselves safe, meant that the timing was really, really hard to manage in that campaign. So I think it was just a collision of very intentional factors from a desperate entity, the supermajority in the Missouri legislature, to hang on to that power. And I think our job now is to say, one, there may be legal hooks to challenge it on. I'm sure that will play through, but it doesn't compel this new terrible way of drawing districts. It just makes it an option. So we have to continue to object that option, which basically eliminates children mostly and non-citizens from the count as you're dividing up the districts, which is really dividing up the resources of the state. So eliminating children from access to representation and resources is terrible and not popular, and the polling did show that once people understood that that's what was going on. But our very ambitious, I think it's several hundred thousands of voter contact found repeatedly on the phones in the last couple weeks, talking to voters about Amendment 3 who had already voted and who were just livid. So we have to then leverage that lividness to make sure that we can try, do our best to prevent the worst provisions of Amendment 3 from going into effect. All the while, there also has to be a legal strategy, and stay tuned. Potentially, there are other strategies. It's the most extreme redistricting measure in the country, and the reason it is because this is the conservative Republican plan to apply to states across the country, and states with much, much larger Democratic voting constituencies who are under 18. So it's the Republicans' answer to addressing the demographic changes that have changed Arizona's politics, that are changing Texas's politics, and to take us way, way, way back in the political land. So as Missourians, now we're under the sort of national responsibility of trying to prevent this thing from happening and therefore spreading.
Thanks. So moving on to the presidential election, as we've been on this call, Trump has spoken, and he has been saying that fraud has been committed in terms of the ballot counting. In terms of just the election of the president and the whole everything that has gone on for the last year or so. Just your quick high-level takes of how that process has worked and what we can expect moving forward.
I mean, my two takeaways is number one, our industry, Tony and mine's industry, did not learn our lesson on Trump. The fact that anybody took that speech live, knowing the falsehoods he has been spewing on Twitter and elsewhere, was completely and totally irresponsible. I advocated for our own shop to stop taking his COVID-19 press briefings live when it became very apparent that he couldn't put the truth out there. Like, yes, he's the president of the United States, but we're also truth. You know, we're supposed to be in the business of providing you facts. And if the president of the United States can't provide facts, then we shouldn't be taking him live. But the fact is, he'll get the views, he'll get the clicks. And the media did not learn over 4 years how to fact check him in real time or how to handle him. There's this assumption that if a president or a politician is going to tell you something, that it's going to be true, especially the president. That didn't happen. And I think just overall, our civic systems are broken. I think so many people didn't know, for whatever reason, how election night actually happens. You know, and the media, I think, also drove part of that. You know, it's always we're going to call this race, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And there's science behind it. They're doing it for a reason. They have data people looking at these numbers. But it's conditioned people to think that the election has to end and always ends on election night, when election night is really just the end of, in most places, the end of when you can actually cast your ballot. And so, you know, regardless of what the outcome is going to be in the presidential race, I think just there is so much civically, and our knowledge of sort of civics, it feels like maybe it's the education system, maybe it's something, but there's just a lack of kind of universal knowledge about how these things are going to work. And the media plays into it by, you know, red state, blue state, this is the call, this is this magic map. And it just could have been handled so much differently. And, you know, explaining context, etc. That was sort of just my biggest takeaway, is how just kind of civically broken, information wise, understanding our systems of government, etc. that this seems to be. It's a little dark, but
So looking forward, I think one of the things that I've been pleased about in the past few days is just the simple, calming, professional tone of Joe Biden. Back to somebody being presidential, and telling the nation to be calm. You know, the numbers are looking good as it relates to Joe Biden. Things are going to be okay. We're going to get through this. We haven't had that sort of traditional calming presidential voice for 4 years. And I think the nation is looking forward to that. I hope that it helps all of us in our various institutions, from the media to polling to government itself, to find a way to get back to that place where we aren't so broken. That's the part that worries me. So we have Trump unhinged right now. How are we all going to deal with that as society after the race is called? How is the Republican Party going to rebuild itself in terms of trying to regain credibility? And how are we in the media going to treat people that we used to treat credibly as credible Republicans, who have been Trump sycophants for the past couple of years and incredibly not, or very much not credible? I think there are going to be some really difficult decisions to make in terms of political coverage in the next couple of months to couple of years. And I don't know how those are going to play out. I have the sort of benefit of being a columnist and not having to always live by the exact same constraints that Rachel, for instance, has to live in under as an objective reporter. But she's right. The media is part of this problem, and we've been broken as well in terms of just how abnormal this current reality is, and how we have failed as objective journalists to call out the abnormal and to do what we can to not magnify it. We've magnified it. And so what's going to happen when Joe Biden signs his first executive order, undoing one of Trump's executive orders, and all of a sudden Republicans decide again that they're against executive orders? Are we going to treat that like it's normal? Is it back to the old rules, or is it the Trump rules where nothing really matters? I don't know the answer to that, but we're going to be dealing with that probably first week of January.
And I think we saw that with Amy Coney Barrett and the call of, oh, well, we're 200 plus days away from the election. We can't vote on a Republican or a nominee for the Supreme Court because the people need to decide, but it is okay for us to vote when our party is in power in the Senate and in the White House. And at some level, I don't know that it matters to the people who support that side of the aisle as much as we might think it does. But yeah, it's interesting. It brings up an idea of norms. Norms are only as good if everyone upholds them. You know, we talk about norms, and that's just a function of society. Society decides what is normal. And sort of to Tony's point, do we go back to a pre-Trump norm of normal, or have the norm shifted? And how do we treat what those norms are and should look like? Because yes, there's a way that things have always been done. Trump did not do that. So what does the media frame it as, and how do we handle that discussion of, is it just you go to everyone, why is this okay when one side does it but not the other? And I mean, hypocrisy is a feature, not a bug in politics, but I think calling it out, making people aware of it. And so the thing about the Republican Senate, it's looking like we may have 2 runoff elections in Georgia, which might actually, I think, decide control of the Senate. It could get it to, I could get it to 50-50, I think. I haven't looked at that map close enough, but they've both dropped below, both of the Republicans have dropped below the 50% they need to avoid a runoff. So
I do believe that that's going to be the January runoff election in Georgia. That's going to be the decide who controls the Senate.
Yeah.
Yeah, so anybody
in Georgia.
yeah, anyone thinking that election season is going to end anytime soon, sorry, that's not going to happen. And you know, so I think that I appreciate what Tony and Rachel have said about, you know, democracy needing to be allowing the election to be completed by counting all of the votes. And someone I'm sure can put in the chat, and CJW has a great campaign around protect the process, protect the vote. And so counting every vote is what I would ask for support for all the great people on this call, many of whom I know and have appreciated their activism so much over the years. So it's time to, you know, exercise those muscles again here in this period. There was a scenario where there was going to be very aggressive, very initial, you know, the minute Wednesday morning turn to stop voting, and that we haven't seen that. So we're in sort of a middling scenario, and you can see Trump revving up his legal teams to try and stop the counting. And so as much support and advocacy we can do to ensure that every vote is counted and not contribute to this nutty narrative that Trump has put out there about election night, I think is important. But I wanted to bring another perspective on the presidential race from, again, as a political practitioner, that what I appreciated about the Biden Harris campaign that was different than in 2016 is, again, a part of my positive vision about politicians and political campaigns not taking anything for granted and really going to engage people in the political process. So whereas the Clinton campaign took some of the historically Democratic states for granted, even when polls in the states, people in the states were saying, no, 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 we need more work. That is not how the Biden-Harris campaign operated. They did go and compete in all the states, not particularly Missouri, but they didn't ignore Missouri the way some previous campaigns had. So I'm really encouraged by what that seems to be showing as the votes get counted in terms of what that means in terms of results. So again, for me, that's engaging people in the political process, not taking one single voter for granted. And then also, it's not sprint, it's a marathon, and sprint right now is, from election season to election season. The marathon is like what Tony mentioned, the Republicans thinking decades back, oh, if I do this in 94, then by 2004, it'll be real hard for Democrats to get a majority in the state legislature. That's exactly what happened. So we have to think like that, both at the federal and the state, and frankly at the local level, and really think about engaging in the political process at every level, so there aren't these uncontested races, and the voters don't get to hear a robust conversation, and nobody's filling the voter head with the united vision, the vision for progress. They're just hearing fear and division. So that's a thing I was thinking about in terms of the presidential, as well as an issue, really connecting to something that people can override some of the fear messaging and really connect the dots for voters. And I think healthcare in this election is absolutely one of those things. People saw that when the Affordable Care Act went into effect, they could find affordable healthcare. Even though the Republicans politicized Obamacare, it actually, once people were able to realize that policy in practice, they liked it. They want to be able to hold on to their health care, despite many of us who have pre-existing conditions. And the Biden campaign, and I think the Galloway campaign, did a really good job. We just have to keep going in that direction and not veer away from it. And us as the citizenry have to continue to engage, and I think expect better. And to Rachel's point about norms, I heard some great political scientists on Fresh Air today talking about there are ways that we did the presidential reform in the 70s, resting a lot of those reforms on people following norms. We can actually make that law and create guardrails around a presidency that doesn't rely on somebody having to just follow the norms because that's the right thing to do. They'll follow those norms because if they don't, then we'll have grounds for impeachment or other actions.
I just want to bring up, and I know that term has become so ubiquitous now that it isn't as sort of party affiliated as it used to be, but one of the things that made me cringe sort of very early on in the debate about the Affordable Care Act was how the media started using Obamacare as a phrase to refer to it. It was originally a phrase that the Republicans used to tarnish the plan as belonging to the President of the United States. And the fact that got co-opted into the media and it's now used as just sort of generically a term by everybody now, I think is just an example of, it's the Affordable Care Act. That's not any more or less easy to say than Obamacare. Like, if you have to explain after a quote that, Obamacare is the name that Republicans have given to the Affordable Care Act, fine. But that was sort of one of those moments where I'm just like, how or why are we using this partisan phrase to refer to a piece of legislation? It's the Affordable Care Act. It's kind of like how like World Wide Web is easier to say than www, but regardless.
Hey, I feel that, Rachel, and see it every time. I will be calling you next time I see St. Louis Public Radio using the anti-label for bills that are not, I am not pointing at you. I'm saying, I'm just going to call you.
Go for it. Seriously, do it. We try to be as careful as we can.
We experience that all the time, and I appreciate you from the inside in the media, you know, working that angle too. So it's us together trying to get it more factually based and not go for the, like you said, the clicks or the shorthand term that is very craftily spun.
Yeah, let's seriously, Mevi, we can take it offline if afterwards,
Yeah.
but yes, we're always, we need to make it, yeah.
So one last question before we have to wrap up, and I think this one's going to be really important, is what do you guys think the role of the courts is going to be in deciding our next president? There's a number of, the president has filed a number of cases, many of which have been thrown out by state court judges. In addition, we have a situation where the U.S. Postal Service didn't actually follow through on an order that was given by a federal judge. So they're in contempt of that federal judge. And how is that going to all play in? And where do you think we're going to go from there?
I'm actually not worried about the courts having to weigh in on this election. I was before the election. I'm not now, because I believe that first of all, all of the state courts are recognizing how completely frivolous the Trump lawsuits are. I think when the Supreme Court, if they're even entertaining any of these ideas, see the president's speech that I haven't seen yet, but I've seen the notes of it on Twitter and in the chat, they're going to realize we're not going to touch this. This is really, really bad for democracy. But mostly, I don't think the courts are going to be involved, because I think the actual electoral number within the next 48 hours or so is going to be much larger than 270. And so I don't think there's really going to be anything that's going to head to the courts. I'm worried about the courts with a lot of different issues, from abortion to the Affordable Care Act to LGBT rights, so many different things, and the courts do worry me, not just the Supreme Court, but the appeals courts in some of the various circuits. But I'm not worried about it as it relates to the election. I think the numbers are heading in the direction that Joe Biden's going to be the president, and it's going to be fairly clear.
I mean, I'm with Tony. I think the issues that the president is trying to raise in his lawsuits are being addressed skeptically by judges appointed by both parties. They're not even getting their facts straight, much less being able to get to a legal issue concern. There was, I can't remember if it was the case out of Georgia or Michigan or one of the places where he was arguing that, oh, my observers aren't in the room. And the attorney literally said, there is not a non-zero number of observers in the room, which took down their factual case. To the question about the post office, I actually posed this question to some Twitter friends of mine or to Twitter and got some legal responses. I don't know, and no one who answered me back knew, if whether they could sanction the Postmaster General Louis DeJoy and say you have been held in contempt. But what no one seems to be certain of is, how do you correct the issue that his contempt potentially created, which is these ballots arrived at their post offices in time, but were not entered into the system as delivered and therefore can't be counted. Contempt is attempting to bring compliance as a motion, as I understand it. But what happens if non-compliance has caused an issue? And people didn't seem to think that there was necessarily a mechanism to do that. So I have no idea what's going to happen with that. The understanding I had from following along with it was that they did not actually find many ballots in the sweep, or enough at least to potentially cause issues. It was, obviously you want to have as many votes counted. All votes, legal votes, should be counted. But 130 ballots is not likely to tip the result of an election, and on the broad scale, such as the presidential. Obviously, the votes should be counted, but yeah, as a lawyer in our chat just put it, no remedy. Then, well, actually, never mind. He wasn't answering the question. Yeah, I don't know what you do when simply holding someone in contempt doesn't fix the issue, when non-compliance has already caused issues. So
Great. And Memi, we're already at 6:31. I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. Do you have anything to add?
I would just say that courts aren't in an isolated bubble, and they, my understanding is Roberts' most concern is sort of the decorum of the court. So I think for this audience, and my message is, we just need to engage as vociferously, peacefully, and visibly as possible in the demand to count every vote, and that matters. It matters in terms of how the courts look at, is this population being like, ho hum, whatever, maybe I don't have to worry about engaging. But if they see that there are civically engaged people who are going to hold everyone accountable to counting the votes, that's the situation we're in right now, whether we like it or not. And we need to continue no matter how long it takes and how hard it feels. And I think this is the perfect audience to absolutely engage every way possible in that effort to protect our democracy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, Heather.
I just wanted to thank our panelists for taking time out this evening. To Rachel and Tony, we are excited to read what you guys write, and Rachel, what you say on the air about these elections in the coming days. And Mevi, we're excited to work with you and Planned Parenthood on all of the issues that we advocate for together. And I'll turn it over to Lisa to close us out.
Okay, thank you, Heather, and thank you so much, Rachel. Tony had to leave. He had a previous engagement, and Mevi, and of course, Heather Silverman, and all of our panelists will receive a certificate to sponsor a child for our back to school store as a thank you. And be sure to join us for our other membership sessions. There's a coffee talk. It's on November 24th, and then also, there's a lunch and learn on Thursday, November 12th. I think Jen put it in the chat, from noon to 1 o'clock with Eric Mink, an award-winning journalist. So thank you all so much for being here tonight. We appreciate it. And have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you. It was an honor to be on.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.